Twins are the best way to address nature-nurture questions. Identical twins, or monozygotic, share almost 100% of their DNA. And fraternal twins, or dizygotic, share about 50%. So by seeing how much more alike the identical twins are than the non-identical, we can get a sense for how much the DNA matters for brain or behavior or all kinds of different variables. Of course, it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. And it's this interaction between the two that's really the key. These days it's usually called G by E interactions. G for genes and E for environment. But what this paper demonstrates is that we need to add a third component to the G and the E, and that third component is age. And so what that means is that in order to understand the effect of a particular gene in a particular environment, we also need to know where that individual is in the course of their development. So it may not seem that surprising that age would matter, but to actually identify the specific facts and figures about how this age by gene by environment interaction hasn't been all that easy, partly because we have to follow people over time as they go from a child to an adolescent to a young adult. In this case, the people have been identical or non-identical twins, but also their brothers and sisters. And genetically, they also will share 50% of the genes. And over the past decade, we've followed about 800 people, having them come to the NIH and about 2-year intervals where we get a scan of their brain. We see how they're doing in school and life, their behavior, their emotions, their cognition, and we see how these factors change over the course of development. The main thing that we found was that it's a moving target. So which parts of the brain are more or less heritable changes a lot as you go from a baby to a child to a teenager to an adult. And so what we've been able to do with these movies that you're seeing is to actually demonstrate the specifics of these changes. And what we see here as the areas in red are the areas of the brain that are most heritable. And what we see is that it's not a one-size-fits-all, that certain parts of the brain become more heritable during adolescence. The other parts are more heritable in early childhood, others in middle ages. And why we think this is important is that these same brain areas that are changing in heritability during adolescence are also the parts of the brain that we acquired most recently in our evolutionary history. And also they're the parts of the brain that are involved in illnesses that happen during adolescence. This has been one of the big mysteries in psychiatry of why do things happen when they do. For a genetic illness like schizophrenia, you're born with those genes, you're born with those risks, so why doesn't it manifest when it does until late adolescence or young adulthood? This has always been one of the big research questions for us. And now we think we might have some insight into that. Because one way of looking at this is that the reason these brain parts get more heritable during adolescence is because they get expressed then. That if they're not being expressed when you're younger, it doesn't matter if you're identical or non-identical because those genes aren't doing anything. But whether it's puberty or other unknown timing factors, when these genes then become expressed, those parts of the brain become more heritable. But if this process goes awry, then it also may be why these illnesses are unleashed when they happen. Most illnesses actually manifest during adolescence. Psychosis, bipolar disorder, eating disorder, substance abuse, anxiety, panic attacks. So literally over 50% of mental illnesses when they happen occur during this adolescent period. And we're particularly interested in these parts of the brain that become more red during late adolescence when many of the illnesses are emerging. And they're the parts of the brain that we've acquired most recently in our evolutionary history, so most different between us and chimpanzees and bonobos. So it all is sort of converging upon this common story of the things that take the longest to develop, also have genetic factors that impact later and later in life. So the next step for us now will be to really try to explore this link between the illnesses that have their onset during this time and the typical brain changes, possibly driven by the same underlying genes. At one age, this particular gene might affect this particular brain in this way, and at a different age, no effect or even an opposite effect. And so I think the whole field will be affected by these sort of findings in terms of really trying to introduce age into the G by E interaction questions.